welcome to the Weekly Wrap with me, Luke Daniel, and of course with Connor Tomlinson. This week we're going to be talking about reform and the very unfortunate predicament they've found themselves in over the last week, and also the sentencing council here in Britain. What is it and what they've proposed, and basically why it's pretty bad. When it comes to reform, it's been a bit of a terrible week for them, very suddenly. They've had a disagreement with one of their MPs, Rupert Lowe.
That's putting it mildly.
That is putting it mildly. So I wondered if you can just sort of take us sort of blow by blow with what's actually happened, and then we can talk about why that might have happened.
So in late February, Rupert Lowe did an interview with Andrew Pearce, calls himself Tory Boy Pearce, a GB News host but writer at the Daily Mail, and it didn't get published until the 5th of March, and it was published in print only, so there was no additional context or expression around Lowe's remarks, but the remarks that were strip-mined from that interview were that Nigel Farage has messianic qualities, but that reform needed to evolve from being a protest party organised around the Messiah into being a party ready for government. So they needed a policy body, they needed to be able to hit the ground running on day one, repeal the laws that get in their way, dismantle the obstructive civil service, and deliver on their electoral mandate. All sensible and constructive criticisms, which Farage then took very personally when they were levelled at him by Harry Cole on Talk, who was standing in for Jeremy Kyle at the time. Harry Cole is one of the editors of The Sun. The Sun also endorsed Keir Starmer at the last election because they like to back the winner. So just seeing that there are vested interests in the media to contort what Rupert Lowe said, and was presented to Nigel Farage as Rupert Lowe making disparaging remarks and making a bid to unseat Nigel Farage as the presumptive king of the British right and the rightful inheritor of number 10 Downing Street when it comes to 2029. Now, for Rupert Lowe's part, in private, he hasn't minded me saying this so far. Lowe has always insisted that, quote, Nigel Farage deserves to be Prime Minister for his tireless campaigning on Brexit. So Lowe has never intended to go for the seat of power. However, Nigel Farage suggested that Rupert Lowe was just saying these things because he wants to be Prime Minister. Pretty much everyone in politics does. Every so often he builds a thing and someone comes along thinking they can do it better and upsets the system, and so Farage has to drop said party and walk away, and it collapses in his wake. And then when he was asked in the last few seconds of the show, will Rupert Lowe be a Reform MP before the next election, he goes, well, I hope so, but it doesn't seem that he wants to be with us very much, so I guess we'll have to see. A few hours later, Isabel Oakeshott, journalist at Talk, but also notably the girlfriend of Richard Tice, the deputy leader of Reform UK, went on the airwaves and when asked about this, told Kevin O'Sullivan, the host of the show, oh, it's sweet, isn't it? Poor old Rupert, he's a bit of a political amateur, and every so often someone like him comes along and goes, yay, I want to be Prime Minister. They always try it, and they always try and get rid of Nigel. And she was smiling like the Cheshire Cat. It was a very knowing smile. Because little did we know, at the time, mechanisms were being put in place to the following day issue a press release with the Chief Whip, Lee Anderson, Tory defector who was persecuted by his own party, then joined Reform as their first MP before the election, and Chairman Zia Yusuf, saying that there have been allegations about bullying in Rupert Lowe's office, both his parliamentary and his constituency office, carefully worded to create a kind of ring of radioactivity around Rupert Lowe as a person.
Everyone assumed Rupert Lowe must have been the one doing the bullying, right?
Exactly. They thought he was some sort of misogynistic hater of people with disabilities. And that also that Rupert Lowe had threatened Zia Yusuf himself on 2 occasions, and that this was being escalated to the police. And so this came out. The whip was immediately withdrawn from Rupert Lowe. He was the most popular MP of Reform's cadre of 4 underneath the leader Nigel Farage, cast out into the darkness, and we thought, well, that's that. And then Rupert Lowe started to disclose details that meant the story didn't quite add up. For example, the Met Police released a statement saying that the police report of the supposed threats that had been made to Zia Yusuf were threats made on the 13th of December, and the report was only made on the 6th of March, while Isabel Oakeshott was on air, sort of gloating about the fact that Rupert Lowe is an amateur, after Rupert Lowe's interview with the Mail had been published, seeming that he was a challenger to Nigel Farage, and the day before the statement was released. And then Rupert Lowe said, well, none of these bullying complaints are about me. They're about a member of my constituency office in Great Yarmouth who had been removed for gross misconduct and then made a complaint afterwards, so it looks vexatious. And another one was about a text that was sent over WhatsApp by someone in his parliamentary office in a discussion that he wasn't involved in at all about a third party. So none of these accusations were against Rupert Lowe. Ever since, his staff in both offices have come out from behind the cloak of anonymity and put their names to it and have said, Rupert is a fantastic boss. He's never done anything wrong. There's no such culture of bullying. We don't get why it's been rubbished in this way.
And I have the quotes here, actually. I mean, so his parliamentary team released that statement, and like you said, they put their names on it. This is quite rare. This is a very rare thing to do, actually. They said, we want to state this unequivocally. Rupert is a good, decent, and honest man. He's a good boss, a good man. He doesn't deserve what's happening to him. They were unequivocal.
Yes. It's not the same to be said by lots of people that have worked with Nigel Farage over the years. In fact, there have been many memes made with Rupert Lowe joining the faces in heaven of the various careers that Nigel Farage has rendered corpses in his wake, including the original founders of UKIP, Stephen Wolfe, Suzanne Evans, Ben Habib most recently as well. Ben Habib has been he's been doing the rounds on media going, I told you so, guys, in that Nigel Farage has a difficulty working with subordinates who he feels are challenging his sole occupation of the limelight. He's not at all like President Trump in that way. Donald Trump is often accused of having an ego on him, and there's no doubt that he does, as a reality TV star and a successful businessman and now president twice over. But Donald Trump is magnanimous in that he's able to take former critics into coalition with him. J.D. Vance once called him a fascist, right? Elon Musk said that he wouldn't vote for him. RFK ran against him, as did Tulsi Gabbard. She was a Democrat. He's brought all of them into his all-star coalition and made peace with them. And it really felt like he was bringing the cast of main characters together to bring his narrative arc to culmination. Nigel Farage has categorically ruled out Rupert Lowe ever rejoining the party. And in doing so, it's been very telling as to why these complaints were made in the first place. Because Richard Tice was asked on Saturday on Camilla Tominey's show on GB News, if Rupert Lowe is cleared of all charges, the criminal investigation amounts to nothing, the parliamentary investigation, by the way, there hasn't been a parliamentary investigation launched into Lowe, very telling, but any sort of disciplinary procedures with the KC, if they all come up squeaky clean for Rupert Lowe, will he be allowed back in the party? And Richard Tice said, we've removed the whip, let's operate under that assumption. So even if he's an innocent man, he will never be allowed back into the party. And then when Nigel Farage has given interviews about this subsequently to ITV and Sky News Australia, he says, well, I don't need this headache. It's completely annoying to me. And by the way, there wouldn't be a Reform MP if I hadn't have come back and led the party. So Rupert Lowe owes his seat to me. So he shouldn't have, frankly, challenged me in the first place. He shouldn't have been so divisive just as we're approaching the county council elections. Seems like this is a politically motivated hit, which has fortunately been thwarted. And the final bit I will mention is that during this, there have been multiple statements released to the Telegraph, right? There are clearly coordination here with Nigel Farage and members in the Farage camp and Telegraph journalists who are releasing Reform's official line about Rupert Lowe. And both anonymous sources and Farage then himself, in the ensuing days, came out and said, we were concerned that Rupert Lowe was being ideologically captured by the very online radical right, hello there, into saying mass deportations. Now, Rupert Lowe has always clarified that he wants the mass deportation of every single illegal immigrant in the country and the 13,000 foreign criminals currently in prison. Now, there are, at minimum, since 2017, 1.2 million legal immigrants in this country. If you want to get rid of all of those, one, that upholds a single rule of law, because allowing them to be in this country means there is a two-tier immigration system in the country, and I think all of Reform's supporters, and I thought his MPs, opposed that. But two, just on logistics alone, how is removing them all not a mass deportation? So saying that is a factual statement. It's also a statement which 58% of the public support, according to Telegraph polling, and it's a statement that just won Donald Trump both the popular vote and all the branches of government, in explicitly promising this to winning over a plurality of male Hispanic voters who usually the Democrat Party would expect would be put off by such rhetoric. So it's a vote winner, it's morally just, and it is feasible. We facilitate 130 million flights every year in the airports in this country. I think 1 to 2 million is within the bounds of acceptability. But previously we thought those are just anonymous sources around Farage. It couldn't possibly be the case, as Rupert Lowe alleged, that his Northwest Essex speech was censored by Farage himself to take out those words. Farage went to the Telegraph and said, I told him not to say mass deportations because I think that's very dark, dangerous and divisive rhetoric. Okay. What is the modus operandi of reform if not to fix our broken immigration system? Nigel Farage has categorically ruled out deportations before, with an interview with Stephen Edgington, with an interview with Winston Marshall, and now with the expulsion of Rupert Lowe. And it seems like all of the charges levelled against Rupert Lowe, or carefully conflated to seem as if they are against Rupert Lowe when they're not, were just the pretext for withdrawing the whip and casting him out into the wilderness because he said things that Nigel Farage didn't like.
Right, okay, so there's a few things there. I mean, we're talking about the ego of Nigel Farage, the sort of the behaviour and general reputation of Rupert Lowe, and then the sort of content of reform policy and how that's shaped and what that could look like in the future. You mentioned Rupert Lowe being very deferential to Nigel Farage, saying he deserves to be the Prime Minister. Nigel Farage obviously seems quite worried, and I haven't seen any polling on this, but Rupert Lowe is anecdotally a much beloved figure in reform, and he brings people who maybe are not traditional reform voters. So I wonder whether you can speak to sort of his character, like what sort of role he plays within the Reform Party. He's pretty, there's not much bravado about him, right? He's pretty level-headed,
yes,
but he's very firm.
But there's a lot of bravado
policy points
around him. That's the encouraging thing, because Rupert Lowe has broad appeal to, let's say, yes, the online right. Now, the idea that there's a separation between online and real life, well, not so much if Reform now feel the need to respond to Rupert Lowe's defence of himself on X, because it's notable that he's basically thwarted this reputation destruction with a few tweets over a few days. So the American election should have taught us, for example, that actually X is a pretty good barometer of public opinion. We just thought that Elon had taken the shackles off and now there's just an overabundance of MAGA content on there and it was a kind of red mirage. Actually, that's where most of the public are. So Reform should have been learning that. If Rupert Lowe is popular on X, and he really is, like he is dwarfing Nigel Farage in terms of engagement, despite having an infinitesimally fewer follower account. He's got a few 100,000, Farage has a few million, and he's still getting more likes and replies and retweets and the like. So Lowe appeases the online right, the Twitter sphere. He appeases lots of the, let's say, anonymous accounts and influencers very concerned about immigration policy that have been put off by Nigel Farage's perceived and now explicit softening on the issue, telling Winston Marshall that by 2050, if we alienate politically all of Islam, we will lose. And it's like, well, what does winning look like, Nigel? What parts of Islamic theology would you like to put into the Reform Party manifesto? Because I would say none. The people that are concerned about that, like Rupert Lowe is a farmer. So credibly, he has a lot of social capital with the farmers' protests, which is, the first sort of proper grassroots protest movement that we've seen in Britain for a very long time. We don't have a Gilets jaunes, we don't have our own Dutch farmers. Now we've got something in response to this Marxist grave-robbing tax from the Labour government. He's very popular with Zoomers. He's got this sort of grandfatherly appeal that Trump had in term 2 that he didn't have in term 1. And he's got a lot of goodwill with his own constituents and the wider country because, much like Trump in term 1, he donates his parliamentary salary every month to a different charity because he doesn't need to be in politics. He's an independently wealthy businessman. He owns Southampton Football Club, can also pull in what we would call the Dinos, but the sort of Essex men that like sports and a pint and are not that engaged in politics, but see that their bank account is diminishing every month and wonder why the demographics of their area has changed. He pulled Tom Skinner in, the sort of iconic meme lad. Exactly. Yeah. You're not seeing lots of other politicians do that, so he can broach this broad tent in a similar way that Donald Trump has, whereas Nigel Farage is acting a little bit. He's meant to be the king in waiting, but he's acting kind of like two kings at the moment, right? It's not just that he's sort of plunged the knife in the back of Rupert Lowe like Lowe is Caesar and he's going et tu Nigel. He's acting a lot like Lear. He's allowed his progeny to squabble beneath him, and he's now left in the wilderness largely without being guided by principle over just seeking the security of his power. But he's also acting a lot like King John. King John has focused on one particular fiefdom. He was very interested in recapturing the sort of French homelands that he came from. Nigel Farage being a Huguenot, so there's a little bit of mimetic energy there. But he ignored the rest of his kingdom as it fell into disrepair. This is where we get the legend of Robin Hood, where punitive taxes were levied against the peasants and the landed gentry by the evil sheriff of Nottingham. So you need a ragtag hero to come in and right the wrongs of the kingdom until the true king returns. Well, at the moment, Farage has neglected his barons. He has left a lot of talent on the table. There is a zero tolerance policy for alternative media. For some reason, they only want to speak to the BBC, Sky News, and ITV because they think that's where all their voter base is winnable. Trump knows that's not the case. He treats them as enemies, and quite rightly so. And I think Rupert Lowe does the same thing. They always want to bring their own influence in-house, rather than the MAGA movement, who outsourced it to this sort of democratic wellspring of new faces, new voices, who can appeal to new voter blocks. Instead, they purposefully employ these people with no organic appeal on the payroll. Like Isabel Oakeshott has some people that she pays to sort of be attack dogs in the Twitter comments, for example. That doesn't speak to a great security or an intent to build a broad tent. And so they've got this weird little fiefdom where they have neglected all of these other pillars of power that have sprung up on their own merits. I'm thinking think tanks, I'm thinking alternative media projects, I'm thinking influencers. And so if you let your barons grow discontented over time, eventually they're going to come to you with a Magna Carta. And that's what I think happens next, actually. I think that the barons get together with Rupert Lowe and Ben Habib and the like and come to Farage with a Magna Carta saying, hey, if you don't respect us as a parallel power base, we will directly challenge you and constrain your right to rule. And I think Lowe has the capacity to do that.
Are you referring to the die-hard reform activist base? Or
them, I think the sort of spurned people that Farage has tried to clip the wings of in his storied political career, which is full of accomplishments, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to disparage Farage there. I think he's a tragic hero in that he has a hamasha, and his hamasha is his ego and the fragility of such a thing.
There's no doubt that Nigel Farage is maybe the greatest politician of the 21st century in Britain, just in order of magnitude, getting things done, but not necessarily following through. And I think I've had so many conversations with people in the last few months, which go something like this. Actually, we've got the perfect recipe. You've got Nigel Farage, who's a wonderful campaigner, who sort of garners a lot of respect from people all over the country, and you have this guy Rupert Lowe, who's emerged with his head screwed on, who says quite sensible things with the right tone as well, because like you mentioned the sort of grandfatherly sense. He says things carefully and and is considered. And I certainly thought, okay, this looks like a recipe for success.
It looks
until last week.
It looks almost like a
depressing.
Purposeful strategy, which is interesting. This is the conversation.
And all parties have to be a broad tent to an extent, right?
Yeah.
And the question is, how broad is that tent? You don't want it to be too broad. It's a problem maybe the Conservatives had, but you need to draw people in, and different strokes for different folks.
Yes, well, this is one problem, is that Farage has been salami slicing off his natural constituencies. If you notice, Trump had no warm feelings, for example, to the likes of Nick Fuentes and the Grippers. But if such figures were ever brought up to him, he always dismissed it because he knew that the media entities presenting him with these boogeymen weren't principally concerned with the health of the MAGA movement from within. They were trying to undermine it and have him pitted against prospective supporters because they'd rather see him dead than victorious, in the literal sense of President Trump. And so he always went on the tack to the media. He didn't concede their grounding. That's not happened with the likes of Tommy Robinson, which Farage, I understand he's probably annoyed about being asked about, but he had a few slip-ups and accused Robinson of doing things that he hadn't actually been prosecuted for before. And in effect, he and Richard Tice estranged the base by saying, we want absolutely nothing to do with Robinson and that lot. Now, there is a large overlap between Reform voters and those that sympathise with Tommy Robinson, because in a healthy country, the likes of Tommy Robinson would not exist. But in a country where, and Douglas Murray's made this point very eloquently many times, in a country where two-tier justice, explicit anti-white racism, Islamist infiltration of our institutions, and the rape, torture and murder of working class white girls by predominantly Pakistani Muslim gangs takes place, the likes of a Tommy Robinson will rise up as a kind of totemic figure on behalf of the working class, whose concerns are not addressed in Spectator columns or on BBC Newsnight. And all Farage had to do was say what Douglas says. Tommy Robinson would not exist in a healthy country. We, Reform UK, are inheriting a mess left to us by a uni party that has let the British people down on immigration, on multiculturalism, on the economy time and time again. We will come in as the adults in the room, we will clean that up, and Tommy Robinson will no longer need to be possible. And you know who said that? Basically Rupert Lowe. Rupert Lowe said, look, I respect Robinson's campaigning on the grooming gangs back when it was unpopular. I don't think he's a particularly prudent actor in getting himself arrested. He's not asked to join Reform. We haven't asked him to join Reform. He might not be right for our party. That's fine. We don't need to insult our voters. That's a sensible strategy that Reform were not, and seem adamant to not, adopt. And so this speaks broader to Rupert Lowe's ability to build a coalition. And people say, Reform UK, Nigel Farage has more brand recognition than Rupert Lowe. Well, okay, number one, polling from YouGov shows that actually Reform's own base is now really split.
Yeah.
So
I think here it says 33% of Reform UK voters think the party would be doing better under different leadership.
And another 33% are indifferent. So only 34% of Reform voters are die-hard Farage supporters, which is astounding. They've made this rod for their own back. They didn't need to split their own voter base this way. Because before, it looked like a careful Ming Vaz strategy of where Farage would act like a sort of above-it-all statesman, and Rupert Lowe would keep the base in line when Farage occasionally said something that looked like he was going soft. When Rupert Lowe was going, don't worry guys, we really will deport all the foreign criminals. It's just Farage is trying to get more percentage points in the polls. This is what I was told by, let's say, people proximate to the awareness of Reform strategy to try and keep people less worried. Because I had criticised Reform before for estranging their base and saying, you're going to end up in this situation. And so now what you've got is a very divided field. You've got Reform trying to play to a gallery who are less likely to vote for them and appease a media which are always going to call them racist no matter what they do. And they've now created a permanent stone in their shoe, because it's not like Rupert Lowe, the kind of man that he is going to go quietly into that good night. He is beloved as a local MP by his constituents, so even if he were to remain independent, he'd probably stay in the Commons. But that's highly unlikely, because you have now all of these barons and power bases ready to invest in something where they've been gate-kept out of Reform. And so all they have to do is galvanise together, possibly with even the support of Elon Musk, because bear in mind, the day that Rupert Lowe had a target on his back is when Elon Musk tweeted out, Nigel Farage is not fit to be the leader of Reform, we need a new leader. And then someone said, what do you think of Rupert Lowe? And he said, I like what he tweets. If Musk decides to inject some cash into Rupert Lowe's project, you've got a viable right-wing party that can challenge Reform.
Yeah, and I suppose the sort of interesting thing about that polling is that it makes it very clear that whatever this Reform project is, whatever party could evolve out of Reform, or whatever Reform, if they manage to sort this mess out, could in the future become, is not contingent on the personality of one person. So it's increasingly looking like it could be a credible party. Now, they only had to stay credible for just long enough that you could get, young talent in there, intelligent people writing policy. I mean, some of the policy proposals they've come out with have been disappointing, to say the least. But, you only have to stay credible for long enough that all of that could change. So this is a massive downside, but, there is a silver lining potentially. You spoke about prudence, though. And I did want to ask, politics is difficult. There are difficult questions being contested. Farage was criticising certain sort of blunt usage of language. You mentioned that Essex speech, which Rupert Lowe gave, which he sort of tried to censor. The public have to be warmed up to certain ideas. They haven't heard, they've not been on Twitter, they've not been bandying these ideas back and forth for years and years. Some things can be presented to them quite abruptly. And tone is very important. How you say things matters. I wonder if you concede that Rupert Lowe maybe jumped the gun at any time, or sort of wasn't careful enough with how he presented some of the ideas, which are probably new to a lot of his audience.
No. And there's a few reasons why. First of all, if you want to keep your base in line, who are going to be canvassing for you and growing your movement, then I can say firsthand, as the person that went to Reform Conference because I was invited to speak in an event without being officially affiliated with the party, but just because I'd supported them in the election, wanted them to do well. When I was asked what number one policy they should be supporting in the next few years in order to win the party of government, and I said mass deportations, a room full of about 100 to 200 of their most diehard supporters who came down to not-so-sunny Birmingham to see Farage speak erupted into applause. Their members expect them to do this, which is why you've now seen the membership ticker go down after their treatment of Lowe and their denunciation of the policy. Second of all, it's a vote winner. As I've already said, the majority of the British public support it, especially for foreign criminals, dual nationals who commit crimes, and illegal immigrants. Right? It's possible. It's within the Overton window because it just won Trump a victory. It's a popular policy, and the greatest frustration, the reason why the Conservative Party lost the last election, was that they kept promising to do things on migration. Reduction of migration that the British public have voted on in every referendum and election since 1974, a reduction of migration that 9 in 10 constituencies want when they underestimate levels of net migration by a factor of 10, thinking it's 70,000 when it's 700,000, something which Farage knows, by the way, because that poll was the reason he ran in Clacton, because Clacton was the most opposed to migration constituency in the country. So they know this is expected. They know this is a vote winner. They know that it's politically and logistically possible, and yet they kept ruling it out. And so Rupert Lowe was being, let's say, a true leader and a true populist, rather than occupying the salami-sliced leftward or perceived centre of the Overton window. He was at the forefront of the Overton window, recognising the direction of travel it's moving it so that he's not manufacturing consent for an idea, but rather giving the public permission to voice the concerns that they already have, which is why his popularity was organic. And the other very silly thing for Reform to do this anyway, rather than internally correcting him, which I don't think they should have done. I certainly don't think it was prudent for Reform to call the police on him, for example, because now you're just going to get anyone who wants to join Reform now are just going to be people that are so subservient that they're willing to have the threat of the police called on them, held over their head in order to comply with Farage and get a safe seat. But what Rupert Lowe has done for Reform is make up 46% of their parliamentary output and has asked about 900 and something questions since getting into Parliament, where Farage has asked 20. Now, of course, leaders and members of the party have different strategies. So I'm not expecting Farage to ask as many questions as Lowe, but it just shows how much work the man was doing, while also constantly tweeting, while giving interviews, while giving speeches. So he was inarguably an asset for the party. And I think, frankly, recognising that he was an asset, recognising that he could be growing a profile on his own, is why he was cut down as a tall poppy.
I guess the next sort of question I have, I was having dinner with a mutual friend of ours a couple of nights ago, and she was very concerned that, Lowe is just new to this whole politics thing. He has the right impulses when it comes to policy, but actually in practice, he has a few failings. And one of those failings is, a sense of deference. You have to have discipline in a party. That's how our country works. It's governed by political parties. You have to have discipline. You have to have, a party line. And maybe he just messed up when he came out with those comments against Nigel. And they were released in a pretty sort of unfavourable and uncharitable way.
But were they against Nigel?
Well, this is it. He spoke about Nigel. He mentioned
spoke about
messianic. Nigel. He mentioned this messianic quality.
Yeah, isn't that not a factual statement?
He knows who he's dealing with. Nigel Farage is someone who's been in the public eye for a long time, who it clearly does have an ego, who may be slightly sensitive in some ways. He should know how his party leader thinks and therefore what he should say. Do you think that it was a failing of Rupert Lowe's to have sort of phrased these ideas in that way?
No, I think that if it's not his job to manage the emotional outbursts of Nigel Farage when he states true things. This is an apocalypse for Reform, and the phrase apocalypse means a revealing or a lifting of the veil. And what it's done is that Rupert Lowe said some non-objectionable and very constructive things about the leadership of Reform, while always maintaining that Nigel should be leader. Nigel then not only publicly overreacted, but the party put itself in a position where if these charges were to be followed through, they would rather see Rupert Lowe rot in a jail cell than make some mild criticisms of Farage. That is actually the party position. They would rather send him to prison than say Nigel Farage has messianic qualities, which is not even an insult. This is how deranged this is. So, it's not Rupert Lowe's responsibility to manage Farage's reaction. And frankly, if Farage's going to act like this, I don't want him leading. I don't blame anyone else for not wanting to lead either. And I'm glad this happened now before, for example, Farage waltzes in to number 10 in 2029, and his inability to defer to a competent all-star team like Trump has in term 2 renders him as ineffectual as Trump term 1. We waste our national populist victory. The civil service is not reformed. All of those pieces of Blairite legislation that Liz Truss pointed out in her piece for Courage Media are not removed. The state stays on rails, and we get economic demise, demographic change, and cultural obsolescence for more decades to come. I would rather this spat happen now so something constructive can rise from the ashes. Now, the question is what happens next? Because at time of recording, hostilities are still going on Twitter. Rupert is still trying to clear his name. Innovatively, by the way, because he's recognised how politics has changed in a tweet that I put out end of last week or start of this week, in the old dirty tricks of briefing against your own MPs, leaking to the press, and making it so that they don't clear their name until days after and it's buried beneath the headlines. They don't work. He thwarted it within a few days with a few tweets, and well done to Elon Musk for allowing him to do that. What does Rupert Lowe do now? Because he's built himself a platform, and he's come out looking like morally just wonderful from this compared to the dirty tricks of reform. Does he join the Conservative Party? I think highly unlikely. Don't forget, he was the chairman of Southampton Football Club, so he knows Rishi Sunak and the family quite well, and he's not too keen about the actions of the Tories, nor is he too happy about the standing down of the Brexit Party, which he was a part of and an MEP, to give Boris Johnson's 2019 victory, which he then rewarded us with the Boris wave of over 1 million Indians in 4 years. So, that's probably not going to happen, especially because the Conservative Party itself is not... It's even less tolerant of the kind of rhetoric that Rupert Lowe is using than Nigel Farage is. I think that's safe to say. Is he going to join any of the other marginal parties? Highly unlikely. For those outside the UK, we have like very small parties that barely even poll at 1% if possible. You know, UKIP is a contaminated brand. There are very nice people in there, I'm sure, but it's another dead body that Nigel Farage's knife is very much stuck in, right? Is he going to join any of the other more fringe parties? No, because any association with the likes of the BNP or something like that is an immediate political death sentence, and I wouldn't want those people to run the country either. I wouldn't trust them running me a bath, let alone a government department, and Rupert is sensible enough to know that. So, is he going to start something new? I think so. I think there's no chance that he and Ben Habib and all of these barons just happily hand over the entire right-wing space to Nigel Farage. Bear in mind, Reform was polling at 14% before Nigel Farage jumped back in. That was by default. That was under Richard Tice, who's not a very charismatic man. You know, he's not exactly leadership material, let's put it that way. So it just means that by default, a populist right-wing party that codes right-wing, that codes anti-immigration, will receive a lot of support. So if they come in as a genuine right-wing party with better branding than... I mean, frankly, Reform does look like a cleaning product. So if they have better branding, if they have polished faces, if they have an effective shadow cabinet of spokespeople, and they have an MP in Parliament, and remember, you can only be a Prime Minister if you're already an MP in Parliament. If they have that, they might have a crack of at least surpassing Reform, potentially being an opposition party. It's a hell of an arse to win in 2029. But it's worth a go. You can't just let a guy who just called the police on you be the presumptive king of the right. It's just not fair.
Well, that looks like, yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. There is this sort of figure looming in the background of all of this. We've spoken about Nigel Farage and, you know, Rupert Lowe and, I mean, Lee Anderson, who you've gone sort of blows with on Twitter recently.
Well, I just pointed out that I was thrown out of the Conservative Party for defending Lee Anderson against being thrown out of the Conservative Party, and then he's now done the exact same process of the punishment to Rupert Lowe. Yeah,
sort of couched in all this sort of bureaucratic HR speak, investigations and all these sorts of things. But there's also Zia Youssef, right, who is the chairman of the party. I wonder if you can sort of explain who he is and why a lot of people in the Reform base are pretty sceptical of him.
Zia Yusuf, as far as I know, founded a multi-million-pound concierge business, did fairly well for himself, and came out of nowhere. Like, nobody knew who he was when he arrived on scene as Reform's, to date, biggest donor. I think he gave him something like £200,000. And then he spoke on stage at Reform's pre-election rally in Birmingham. He then spoke on stage at Reform's September conference in 2024, after the election. And they sort of presented him as the second coming of Nelson Mandela. You know, he was speaking a lot about British values and being a patriotic son of Sri Lankan migrants, if I believe properly. And to top it all off, he's a Muslim. Now, as you can imagine, for a party that is called racist and Islamophobic constantly, Nigel Farage leapt at the chance to have a Muslim of immigrant heritage represent Reform UK, because it gives them a certain level of regime-approved body armour, right? They have a deflector shield for all those allegations. And we know this because during the election, Richard Tice put out a montage of a man walking through a field saying, "They say we're all racist." Smash cut to non-white candidate, repeatedly. They used this with Ben Habib, first of all, as well. Ben did not like that. He's made that public. So anyway, point being, Zia Yusuf arrived at an opportune moment. He had the fertile ground in which to plant his roots as the patriotic British Muslim who stands up for British values, which he defines as freedom of religion. Not something that the sectarian Christian wars throughout our history really make a British value until very recently, but hey, I'll leave that to Fraser Nelson. Point being, Zia Yusuf then after the election decided, well, I'd like to take an influential role in Reform UK, and was made chairman. Now, he came quite late to the party. And this upset a lot of people because him becoming chairman at the same time was followed by the removal of Ben Habib as deputy leader. Now, the reason given for this was, of course, Ben Habib did not win a seat in Parliament. We needed a deputy leader in Parliament who was capable of being deputised if Nigel Farage was away. It makes perfect sense for Richard Tice to do that. Why was Ben Habib not made chairman? This was the question. He was a loyalist, his Brexit Party MEP. He co-led the Reform Party in the years in the desert where Nigel Farage was not there. He helped get the party to 14% in the polls. He was popular with the local branch organisers. He knew everyone. He did the groundwork. He was very effective on the airwaves, on GB News and Talk TV and the like. He had goodwill with the base. He would go around and talk to these alternative media enterprises and these think tanks and the like. And he knew his policy, and he very effective messenger for the cause. Why was he ostracised? Well, it turns out, over the years, he had been seen as a threat to Farage's power and had criticised Nigel to his face. And so, when it got to Ben Habib saying, look, I'm going to have to leave the party because you've been, from central office, Zia Yusuf, cutting off loyal branch members with no warning and replacing them with your guys, rubbishing their reputations in a similar way that you have with Rupert Lowe, and running Reform as a kind of fiefdom with no gratitude for the people that brought it up, and a softening on, coincidentally, Islam especially. Nigel Farage took to the airwaves and said, it's a champagne moment. Ben's criticised me more than the Labour Party. I'm so glad that he's gone. And he reportedly, according to James Heal of The Spectator, when he received news at a press conference that Ben had resigned, he sang, the sun has got his hat on, hip, 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 hooray. Now, that's not very becoming for the presumptive king of the right. It's mean girl politics. It's reputation destruction. It's the kind of thing we've seen time and time again, and now culminating with Rupert Lowe. So people are going, well, okay, Zia Yusuf seems to not have much goodwill with the base. He seems to be cutting off branches. He seems to have come basically out of nowhere, and now his arrival seems to have preceded Nigel Farage softening on mass deportations of illegal immigrants, but particularly Islam. And so people are wondering, is it like bringing a vegan to the barbecue, where you have this one person with specific dietary requirements you want to accommodate, and then people start thinking, well, it's too much hassle to cook two things, so we're just all going to cook vegan burgers anyway, and everyone becomes vegan by default. And it certainly looks that way. Now we have the preposterous suggestion from Majid Nawaz, a friend of Nigel Farage, that Nigel Farage could win the Muslim vote in this country. At the same time that Reform, now particularly with the removal of Rupert Lowe, is on parity with independent, sectarian, pro-Gaza Muslim MPs that have been voted in by, let's say, 4 to 6 million people total in a country of 60 to 70 million people. If Reform think that they are going to win the Muslim vote over an explicit Muslim sectarian party, they are deluded. So who is telling Nigel Farage that that is the case? And people, because immigration concerns are coupled with concerns about cultural integration, and Islam is the most virulent, indigestible strain of that, particularly with the recent terror attacks for the last 2 decades. They've been responsible for, I think it's 94% of all deaths in terror attacks since the 1990s. They're responsible for 80% of counterterrorism's open caseload, the majority of MI5s. I think it's 40,000 Muslims are on the watch list, which equates to 1% of their whole population in the country. All of those concerns are very reasonable, and suddenly there's a chilling effect in talking about Islam in Reform UK because they have a Muslim chairman. So people are questioning, okay, is Zia Yusuf really a net asset, or is he a neutralising effect, and did he, because Rupert Lowe is very outspoken about the Pakistani Muslim rape gangs and the family members who covered up the crimes of the perpetrators because they saw the white working class girls as non-Muslims, was he involved in the silencing? And the suggestion, given the police were called on him for comments he supposedly made to Zia Yusuf, the suggestion seems to have some merit.
Interesting. I mean, it does seem quite ridiculous, the idea that you would attempt to win the overall Muslim vote when there are parties who are explicitly going for that vote, regardless of how many patriotic Muslims there are in this country. Which, I mean, there are many, right, who potentially could vote for reform, but you can't completely pivot the party to bring these people in.
They're a diminishing few number, and Nigel Farage knows this because in a pre-election interview with Trevor Phillips on Sky News, he cited Henry Jackson Society polling that said that British Muslims are getting more radical, and it's specifically British Muslim men, 18 to 30, university educated, born in the UK, so not even imported. 75% of them believe that Hamas did nothing wrong on October the 7th. 52% want to criminalise drawing the Prophet Muhammad, and I think there's about 30-odd% said that Britain should be a Sharia law country. Right. There is no integrating that, especially because they're already born here and have been through all of Britain's institutions, supposedly which shower them with British values. Mohammed is now the number 1 most popular baby name in England. Also Zia Yusuf's first name. Not much bones is made about that in public. If you're asking, will this nation of Mohammeds abide by British values, I suggest you might be asking the wrong question and you have absolutely no idea what your electoral strategy is. Instead, Reform, and it codes as this, even though it doesn't want to be this, should be the party for the silent majority and the settled, indigenous, working class, white population of the UK, and, of course, the sort of grateful house guests who live here and are most concerned about the importing of this tribalistic political Islam, like the British Jews who have been here for over 100 years, who get hurled abuse at them when walking down the street when the October the 7th Hamas protests have happened every weekend and Wednesday in Westminster at the permission of Sadiq Khan. Right? They should be coding as that party because that is the sane, sensible, and often silenced majority. You know who knows that? President Trump, because he just won that.
So we should talk now about the Sentencing Council.
Speaking of two tiers.
Speaking of two tiers, it's a good segue. It's a non-departmental body responsible for issuing sentencing guidelines. Deciding, how long people should be put away for when they've committed whatever crime they've committed. It's an example of one of these bodies that we've created and we've handed over political power to, and we've in effect, taken serious decision-making power away from the Secretary of State responsible for justice with their democratic mandate, and we've given it to a sort of body which is not politically accountable. They've been in hot water over the last week because of new guidelines that they have proposed. I wonder if you could tell us what this, the story is here.
So the Sentencing Council, and this has been in consultation for a long time, so ministers of both parties have known about this, but the Sentencing Council has proposed that rather than a custodial sentence, people will get a sort of civic sentence if they are members of protected groups. And these are usually under the Equality Act, but these include women, people with disabilities, if you've disclosed a transgender status, if you're a member of an ethnic, religious, or cultural minority, and so what it instantiates explicitly in law is a two-tier of justice for straight white men who per capita are less likely to commit violent crime in this country, and crimes of most kinds, and literally everyone else that they have defined a priori as an oppressed victim group. So they are trying to remedy what they would call systemic injustices in sentencing. For example, how could it possibly be that a man in a dress is more likely to commit sex crimes? Boggles the mind. Must be some kind of prejudice in the system. And so we must allow those individuals, if they claim to be part of one of those oppressed victim groups, to have more leniency in sentencing, whereas we must imprison more straight white men for comparable crimes so we can balance the scales of justice, not in the blind way, but in the Ibram X. Kendi, the only way to remedy past discrimination is present discrimination way. And this is all premised on sort of blank slate idea that every single human being is fundamentally equal deep down, and all differences are a proxy for oppression having happened at some point in their interaction with the institutions of civic society. And so it is the job of the liberal democratic state to expunge those differences and thereby expunging the oppression, realizing social justice. What this actually means is that you are going to be racist towards straight white men for no reason other than ideology. No reason other than trying to implement an egalitarian utopia. Now, Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood has said there will never be two-tier justice in this country. However, one of her underlings, her advisors, was present in the sentencing council meetings where these guidelines were being cooked up. And they're there in black and white. They're not opaque about their desire to discriminate against straight white men at all. No objections were raised during all of this. And then when Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary, quite politically cleverly, I will say, got up and said, well, I've got a bill in front of me right now. And what this does is it says the Sentencing Council, which was passed by a Conservative government, by the way, another quango instantiated in the Cameron years, but the Sentencing Council can't pass new guidelines which supersede parliamentary law without the express permission of the Lord Chancellor, the Justice Secretary. And she has declined to sign that off. Instead, I think she's ameliorating it in some sort of police crime in courts bill that Labour are putting through, which means between early April and the time that bill passes, there will be a period in this country where if you are a white male, you will be sent to prison, more likely to be sent to prison, for an offence, the identical offence that is committed by someone who is black, trans, gay, or a Muslim or a woman.
It is interesting, though, that we do have a Lord Chancellor, Secretary of State for Justice, Shabana Mahmood, who has come out and said, as you just said, as someone who is from an ethnic minority myself, I do not stand for any differential treatment before the law for anyone of any kind. There will never be a two-tier sentencing under my watch.
Okay, get rid of the Equality Act then. Oh, you won't.
Well, this is just it. And then we have obviously Robert Jenrick, who said our justice system is set to have an anti-white, anti-Christian bias, and like you said, Sentencing Council introduced by under the Conservatives. Also, the previous Conservative government was consulted, I think, numerous times on this potential change in the guidelines and did nothing about it. Regardless of whether Shabana Mahmood should do something right now or whether for political reasons they want to introduce it into their own bill, a Labour introduced bill which will sort this problem out. We're in this situation where there are bodies, and the Sentencing Council is just one of them, that exist completely outside of the sort of democratic mandate, where politicians over the span of a decade and a half now have consistently deferred responsibility on certain questions, whether it's to experts or whether it's to people who they think can make difficult decisions so they don't have to be held accountable for them. And it's our own kind of deep state in a way. And I wonder what we have to do to get rid of that.
So as far as I know, there are over 400 quasi-NGOs, which we call quangos, that have been erected mainly in the Blair and subsequent Cameron and Johnson governments. And they are these ostensibly neutral advisory committees, but which are empowered mainly by the 2005 Constitutional Reform Act and the 2010 Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, which put the Civil Service Code into law, which mandated the civil service is a neutral institution and that ministers can't interact with the civil service for fear of politicising it. Therefore, career civil servants just appoint other civil servants and ministers can never fire anyone, unlike in Washington where the president makes appointments, right?
And these people don't have politics at all.
Yeah, exactly. You don't. Yeah, you get involved in politics, but you have no political agenda. Sure. Point being, actually, here's a good example. So Gus O'Donnell, who was the cabinet head of the cabinet office, head of the civil service, he was nicknamed God, as in like the sort of abbreviation of his name, but because he had so much power. This was under the Blair and Brown years and a little bit of early Cameron. He spoke to author David Goodhart, who is kind of like centre-left, really, quite soft, in The Road to Somewhere. And David Goodhart tells a story where he was at a dinner at Oxford and he said he was writing this book about the difference between the sort of ideological elite, the ones obsessed with egalitarianism and turning the world into their constituency, their domain of moral concern, versus the somewheres who are very rooted in a time and place, the kind of people that vote for reform, for example, that are concerned about immigration and cultural and demographic change and how global manufacturing has removed opportunities from their town. And Gus O'Donnell said, "When I was at the Treasury, I lobbied for the most open immigration policies possible because I thought my duty wasn't to my country but to global welfare." Right. If you think the civil service is neutral, that statement tells you all you need to know. Point being, ministers are not allowed to interfere with the civil service. Because if they do, they're politicising the institution, they're being unbecoming of their office, they're breaking the ministerial code. And so, even if Shabana Mahmood was opposed to these changes, and I don't think she is, I think she's just concerned that it being so explicit has made a political headache for her. I think she's very happy with two-tier justice because she didn't raise a stink about this as Lord Chancellor while Keir Starmer was locking up critics of the government for Facebook posts versus the Muslim militias who are actually physically armed being told, "Go on lads, put your weapons in the mosque and we'll say no more about it." She's not against this, but even if she wanted to do something about it, she can't really, because if she tries to step in, she'll be told she's corrupting the civil service with politics, just let these procedures go on and on. So what we need to do about it, as Liz has written eloquently on for Courage, is have a sort of day one great restoration bill that repeals all of these pieces of Blairite legislation and even older, like there's stuff like the Countryside and Town and Planning Act in the post-war government that prevents you from building houses in sensible places, or the 1986 Public Order Act passed by Thatcher, which has led to all of these hate speech crimes and bits of legislation which justifies people praying silently inside their head outside an abortion clinic as some kind of speech violation, right? All of these bits of legislation need to go on day one. And the main bits of legislation that need to go are the Human Rights Act, the Constitutional Reform Act, the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, and you need to abolish the Supreme Court so it cannot get in your way. Because lots of people in this country have pairs of underwear older than that Supreme Court. It's not like America, they're not particularly legitimate. And so it gets rid of judicial activism, it gets rid of activism in the civil service, it allows you to hire and fire public sector employees who are meant to be accountable to the democratic mandate, and it makes Parliament sovereign again. And so it can block nonsensical stuff like this that's going to send people to prison purely on the basis of their race.
The only thing in the country that should be supreme is the king in Parliament. And I think that probably sums it up. We need to get back to that position, and maybe reform, if it becomes sensible again, could do that. It doesn't look likely. Potentially Rupert Lowe at the helm of a new project galvanising the traditional sort of right base in this country might be able to get that done. But for now, that's been the weekly wrap. Thank you so much for joining me and talking so eloquently about all of these issues. Thanks.
Pleasure, sir.